In the summer of 1903, surveyor Silas Vail and land clerk Ruth Calder were sent to measure an isolated spring pond before the surrounding field could be divided and sold. They arrived beneath a copper-colored afternoon sky, carrying chains, stakes, rope, and a leather ledger. The pond looked ordinary from a distance. Up close, Ruth noticed that the tall grass moved in the wind, while the black-green water remained perfectly still. Silas drove a wooden stake into the north bank and stretched the survey chain toward the eastern reeds. Ruth recorded every number precisely. 42 feet, then 56, then 71. When they measured the same distance again, the chain reached 74 feet. Silas blamed uneven ground. Ruth checked the stakes. Neither had moved, yet 3 additional feet of shoreline had somehow appeared between them. Beside the broad cracked stone, Silas opened his brass compass. The needle swung past north and pointed toward the pond's dark center. He turned in a complete circle. The needle followed the water rather than the earth. When he stepped closer to the shoreline, it began trembling so violently that the glass buzzed. Somewhere beneath the flat stone, something answered with a faint metallic tapping. They continued along the bank, measuring the pond from every direction. The sinking sun reflected on the surface. The crooked trees reflected. Even the reeds appeared as dark green blades in the water. Silas and Ruth did not. When Ruth leaned over the edge, the pond showed only the empty sky where her face should have been. Then a pale hand appeared in the reflection and pressed upward from below. At the east bend, Silas pushed through the reeds while Ruth remained on firmer ground. The cattails began bending toward the narrow opening leading to the spring eye. They did not move with the wind. They leaned inward together, then straightened, then leaned again. Ruth realized they were moving in the slow rhythm of breathing. With every inward breath, the mud beneath Silas's boots pulled him closer to the water. On the south mud shelf, 3 pale stones were visible beneath water no deeper than Silas's ankles. He stepped onto the first stone, then the second. When his boot reached for the third, the bottom dropped away. Silas jerked backward before his weight could shift. His measuring pole slipped from his hand, entered the shallow water, and vanished upright without ever striking the bottom. The west bank was narrow, with deep water touching the exposed roots of 3 crooked trees. Ruth crouched to examine markings cut into the pale wood. They were not letters. They were groups of short vertical lines, each ending in a circle. As she watched, a fresh line slowly split the bark by itself. A circle opened beneath it, wet and black, resembling a person hanging above a hole. The light faded before they could finish. Rather than cross the empty field in darkness, Silas arranged 2 bedrolls near the north bank while Ruth lit their brass lantern. As Silas placed his compass beside the cracked stone, a knock sounded beneath it. Not from the water, from directly inside the stone. After a long silence came a second knock, louder than the first. Silas quietly moved the compass away. Ruth awoke after midnight to the sound of bare feet walking through mud. The lantern had burned low, but she could see wet footprints circling their bedrolls. Silas was asleep beside her, his feet dry. The prints continued around him, then stopped near his head. Water dripped onto his sleeping face, though nothing stood above him. Ruth looked toward the pond and saw a human-shaped gap in the reflected moonlight. Ruth woke Silas, and together they approached the shoreline with the lantern raised. A single bubble rested over the spring eye without bursting or creating a ripple. A voice rose from beneath it. It sounded exactly like Ruth. "Silas," it whispered. "Come farther out." Ruth stood beside him, clutching his arm, while the voice repeated her words from below in the same frightened tone she had not yet used. They retreated from the water and sat awake until the lantern dimmed. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Ruth glanced toward Silas's bedroll. A second Silas was lying beneath the blanket. Its back faced them, and water streamed from its hair. The real Silas tore the blanket away. Nothing remained beneath it except a deep, human-shaped depression filled with black pond water. At dawn, the water inside the bedroll was gone. The mud held no footprints, and the pond once again appeared harmless. Ruth opened her ledger to review the previous day's measurements. Beneath her final written line, new words had appeared in blurred blue pencil. Silas Vail, Sunset, North Stone. Ruth tore out the page, but the same sentence was waiting on the sheet beneath it. They should have left. Instead, Silas insisted on completing the survey. He said a defective compass, unstable mud, and exhaustion could explain almost everything they had witnessed. They changed into fresh work clothes and began again. As Silas hammered in the first stake, every reed around the pond turned toward him. Ruth heard a low sound under the grass, like hundreds of people whispering his full name into the soil. From the north bank, they studied the circular spring eye. A bubble rose from its center and remained on the surface. Inside the bubble, Ruth saw a tiny distorted image of Silas, standing chest deep in black water. The real Silas stood safely beside her. When she reached toward the bubble with a pole, the miniature Silas looked directly at her and silently opened his mouth in terror. Silas tied a metal weight to their measuring rope and lowered it into the spring eye. 20 feet disappeared, then 40, then the entire 100-foot rope. The weight never touched bottom. Instead, the rope became perfectly vertical and pulled tight. Silas wrapped it around both hands. Something far below gave one patient tug, as though testing his strength. Then another tug pulled him to his knees. They cut the rope and returned to the north bank. Silas knelt beside the broad, cracked stone, convinced that a hollow space beneath it might explain the noises. He pressed his ear against the cold surface. At first he heard water moving somewhere impossibly deep. Then he heard his own voice say, "Do not let me climb out." Silas lifted his head. From underneath the stone, his voice began laughing. Ruth seized Silas's arm and pulled him away. As they stood, she caught sight of their reflections. Her reflection copied her movements. Silas's did not. The reflected Silas floated face down beneath the surface, his shirt drifting around him and his boots hanging over darkness. When the real Silas backed away, the drowned reflection rolled onto its back and opened its eyes. Silas finally agreed to leave, but he wanted one last measurement from the north stone to the spring eye. Ruth begged him to abandon the equipment. He stretched the survey chain across the mud while Ruth recorded the distance. The chain tightened before reaching the water, as though someone had taken hold of its far end. One link at a time, it began sliding into the pond. Silas grabbed the chain and pulled it back. His brass compass slipped from his vest pocket, struck the cracked stone, and rolled into the shallows. It landed upright beneath several inches of clear water. The needle spun rapidly, reflecting flashes of the lowering sun. Silas told Ruth to remain on the bank. The water beside the stone reached only to his knees. Retrieving it should have taken one step. Silas placed one boot into the pond. Mud pressed softly beneath it. He placed his second boot beside the compass. That foot found nothing. His leg plunged downward to the hip while the other remained planted in knee-deep water. Silas grabbed the stone, but something twisted his submerged ankle. His body jerked forward as though a trapdoor had opened beneath the pond. Ruth caught his wrist. For one terrible second, Silas hung between the bank and the dark opening beneath him. Then the water rose around his body without splashing. It folded over his shoulders, his mouth, and his terrified eyes. The pond closed above his head without producing a single wave. Ruth still held his hand beneath the surface, until the fingers gripping hers suddenly became much longer than human fingers. Ruth screamed and released the thing beneath the water. She seized the remaining rope, looped one end around a tree root, and threw the coil where Silas had disappeared. The rope did not drift. It dropped vertically downward as if a heavy hand had caught it. Ruth pulled with both hands. Something pulled back from an impossible depth. The wet rope sliced through her gloves and tightened until the tree root groaned. Ruth wrapped the rope around her waist and leaned backward. For one moment, it began to rise. A pale shape moved beneath the surface. Silas's face appeared several feet below her, staring upward through black water. His mouth opened. Instead of bubbles, dozens of voices poured through the rope into Ruth's hands, all whispering. There was no bottom until he stepped in. Then Silas's face was dragged straight down and vanished. The rope tore free with such force that Ruth fell against the cracked stone. When she looked up, the pond was motionless again. Silas was gone. No hat, boot, bubble, or ripple marked where he had vanished. Only his brass compass remained visible beneath the shallow water, standing upright beside the stone. Its needle spun faster and faster while the setting sun turned the surface red. Ruth knelt at the shoreline until the last edge of sunlight disappeared. The compass continued spinning beneath the perfectly still water. Then something struck the underside of the cracked stone. One slow knock. A second knock followed, hard enough to shake mud from the stone's edge. The third knock was followed by Silas's voice, whispering from directly beneath Ruth's knees. The pond knows me now. Ruth stared into the water. Her reflection was finally there, but the woman beneath the surface was smiling. Silas did not fall into a naturally deep part of the pond. The bottom vanished because the water had already chosen him. The changing measurements, the false reflection, the voice beneath the stone, and Ruth's impossible ledger entry were warnings of a death the pond had decided would happen before sunset. When Silas disappeared without a wave, the pond claimed its first drowned name. The 3 knocks beneath the cracked stone proved that some part of him remained trapped below, aware but unable to escape. Then Ruth finally saw her reflection, and it smiled while she did not. That means the pond was no longer finished with Silas. It had begun choosing Ruth next.
Thanks for watching.